The request came casually. Too casually. "Hey, Marcus, can you stay a bit longer tonight? Ben just called in sick again." Marcus looked up from his desk, the glow of the monitor casting soft shadows on his tired face. It was already 6:47 p.m. The office had thinned out. Only the soft clatter of keyboards and the hum of the vending machine filled the space. Across from him, his manager, Ryan, stood with his arms folded like the question wasn't a question at all, just a procedural formality. Marcus hesitated. His fingers hovered above the keyboard. Behind his calm expression, his mind flashed to the text he hadn't yet answered from his younger brother. "Still dinner at 8? Let me know. Been looking forward to it." His mouth opened, almost forming the word sorry. But not out of defiance. Out of guilt. Out of habit. "I can stay till 10, Marcus said instead, with a soft nod, swallowing the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ryan smiled. "Appreciate it. You're a lifesaver. I'll let Janine know you've got the handoff." As Ryan walked away, Marcus turned back to his screen, but his fingers no longer moved. His body stayed still, but his chest tightened, like something invisible had clenched its fist around his lungs. Outside the tall office windows, the city pulsed with neon and night. A train passed in the distance, whistling faintly. But inside him, a different kind of noise had started, the silent churn of resentment. He hadn't wanted to say yes. He hadn't meant to say yes, and yet here he was, again, being the reliable one, the helper, the one who didn't make things difficult, the one who could be counted on to absorb the tension so no one else had to. That was the role, wasn't it? Not officially, not in his job title, but it was written in invisible ink across every room he entered. Marcus can handle it. Marcus won't say no. Marcus gets it. He rubbed his eyes. They burned, not from tears, but from the weight of another unspoken need he had just denied himself. Later that night, when he cancelled dinner, his brother replied with a thumbs-up emoji and nothing more. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment, and that made it worse. As Marcus rode home on the last train, his reflection stared back from the darkened window. A man in a neatly pressed shirt, collar askew, face weary, carrying a backpack heavier than it should be. He didn't look heroic. He looked like someone slowly unraveling from the inside. He sat there wondering, why do I feel like I've done something wrong for saying no to a dinner I promised? He had helped. Again. He had been kind. Again. He had filled the gap. Again. And yet the gnawing feeling wasn't pride. It was guilt. But guilt for what? Carl Jung once wrote that what we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. Marcus didn't know that quote, but he lived it. He stepped off the train. Cold air brushed his face. The city smelled like metal and rain. At home, he dropped his bag by the door and stood in the kitchen without moving. No music, no noise, just the hum of the refrigerator and the fluorescent light flickering above. In the silence, it hit him. He didn't feel guilty because he had wronged anyone. He felt guilty because he had stopped playing the role, the mask, the part of him that others depended on, not because they needed him, but because they were used to his silence. This wasn't just about staying late at work. It was about something deeper, something older, something trained. The role of the helper wasn't just a personality trait. It was survival. It was the way Marcus had learned to earn connection. As a child, he had learned that being agreeable made others stay, that saying yes made things safer, that being needed was the same as being loved. But now, the mask was slipping. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt hollow. And behind the hollow was something darker, fear. Who was he, if not the one who showed up? Who was he, if not the one who always said yes? Marcus didn't know yet. But the first crack had formed. He looked at his reflection in the microwave door. just a man in a dim kitchen, realizing he had spent most of his life shaping himself to be acceptable. And the guilt? It wasn't truth. It was the echo of a lie he had been taught to live. A lie that said, your worth comes from what you give, not who you are. And now, for the first time, he was beginning to question it. The mask of the helper, Jung would call it. A persona. And when that mask slips, the guilt doesn't come from truth. It comes from the fear of who they are without it. Comment if you've ever noticed this in someone you know. Marcus didn't hesitate this time. He looked up from his desk as Daniel, his manager, stood at the edge of his cubicle holding a familiar expression, equal parts urgency and forced camaraderie. "Hey, Marcus," Daniel began, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Would you mind staying late again tonight? Aaron just called out, and we've got to finalize the client specs." Marcus closed his laptop slowly. "Actually, I can't tonight," he said. His voice was calm, steady, too even for someone who had just said no for the first time in 5 years. There was a beat of silence. Daniel blinked. "Can't. I have somewhere I need to be," Marcus replied. No explanation. Just a quiet, firm line drawn in the sand. The mask cracked there, though no one noticed yet. The office around them carried on, the hum of keyboards, the soft whirl of the HVAC. But for Marcus, the air had shifted. His heartbeat ticked louder than the printer's. He knew what was coming. It was never about this one moment. It was about all the other moments, when he'd said yes through gritted teeth, when he'd stayed late while his brother's birthday dinner passed cold, when he'd nodded along while his idea was pitched by someone else and praised like original gold. Daniel chuckled softly, masking his surprise with performative levity. "All right, man. Just checking. Thought you were always up for stepping in." Then he walked away. The words weren't a reprimand. But Marcus heard it, the change. Not in volume, but in temperature. The warmth Daniel used to show him, the way he clapped him on the back after meetings, the inside jokes, it dimmed. By the next day, it was colder still. In the days that followed, Marcus wasn't invited to the 8 a.m. brainstorm. His name didn't show up in the new project lead assignments. When he joined conversations, they shifted. When he spoke, people nodded, but didn't hear. The isolation wasn't hostile. It was surgical. By Friday, he sat alone at lunch. The same men who used to ask him for weekend favors now asked other people. And the worst part? A small part of Marcus wanted to go to Daniel and say, "Never mind, I'll stay late." But that wasn't the voice of his truth. It was the voice of his old self, trained to please, conditioned to be liked, addicted to validation like oxygen. He went home that evening and stood in front of his bathroom mirror longer than usual. His reflection looked the same, button-down shirt, navy slacks, tired eyes. But something in the eyes had changed. Not defiance, not pride. Something heavier. He whispered to his own face, "Why do I feel bad for choosing myself?" And the answer came, not from the mirror, but from the ache in his chest. Because he'd made a trade. For years, he had given up pieces of himself to stay needed. Every extra shift, every silent moment when he should have spoken up. Every yes that meant swallowing a no, those were the payments he made to belong. Now he had defaulted on that contract, and the guilt wasn't for hurting anyone else. It was for breaking the rule he didn't know he'd written. I must always be available to be loved. That night, he sat at his small apartment desk, opened a notebook, and wrote down 2 columns. On one side, what I do to be liked. On the other, what I want, even if it disappoints. The first list poured out easily. Work late, say yes, smile, nod, agree, stay quiet. The second list was harder. He hesitated, then wrote, say no. Then, leave when I'm tired. Then, ask for credit. Then finally, with shaking hands, matter even if I'm not useful. Marcus stared at the words. He hadn't betrayed anyone. He'd just stopped betraying himself. The next Monday, he walked into the office knowing what would come. Less warmth, less inclusion, but more truth. And the longer he sat with that discomfort, the more he realized it was not his end, but his beginning. He was not abandoning kindness. He was defining it, and for the first time in years, he wasn't acting a role. He was living a choice. Have you seen your own mask slip under pressure? Marcus stared at the message glowing on his monitor. Need you to stay tonight. Presentations tomorrow. We're counting on you. It wasn't a question. It never was. The office around him hummed with keyboard clicks and low chatter, but in his chest, something had gone still. He glanced at the photo taped beside his screen, his younger brother in a hospital gown, smiling with 2 thumbs up. The caption in their inside joke handwriting, "One more night of this hospital pudding and I'll forget how real food tastes." He reached for his phone, thumbs hovering over the screen. Then, steadying himself, he typed, "Can't tonight. Family emergency. I'm heading out at 5. He hit send. At first, there was no reply, then just a thumbs up. No, "Hope everything's okay." No, "Take care." And the silence that followed wasn't quiet. It throbbed. By 5:04, Marcus had packed his laptop, grabbed his coat, and stepped toward the exit. He felt it, eyes lifting from screens, not curious, not concerned. Measuring. A breath caught in his throat as he passed Carl, the team lead, who didn't look up but tapped his pen harder with each of Marcus's steps. By the time he reached the door, the temperature in the room had dropped. The air behind him felt colder than the street outside. The next morning, Marcus returned earlier than usual, to make sure everything he had handled still worked. But something had shifted. It was subtle. His good morning met with nods instead of greetings. His contributions in the stand-up meeting were skipped. When someone needed help debugging a build, they walked past him to Jordan, the intern. It wasn't overt. It was quieter than punishment. It was subtraction. He tried to shake it off. "They're just stressed," he muttered to himself, rearranging the sticky notes on his monitor, color-coding feedback for the client module. But the whispers started that afternoon. In the hallway, at the coffee machine. "Marcus is pulling back. I heard he just left. Didn't even check the final decks." Yeah, less reliable now. And then it happened. During a team sync, Carl mentioned they'd be redistributing Marcus's responsibilities to ensure project integrity. No eye contact, no discussion, just a clean handoff, like setting down a tool that had dueled. Afterward, Marcus approached him in the corridor. "Carl, can we talk for a second?" Carl didn't stop walking. "Sure, walk with me." Marcus matched his pace. "I just wanted to clarify. About the redistribution, was there a concern with my work?" Carl paused, then turned, tone polite but blade thin. "Look, Marcus, everyone appreciates your dedication, but lately, it seems like you're not as available. We just need people we can depend on, especially in crunch moments." Marcus blinked. "That was one evening. My brother, he was in the ER." Carl nodded, not unkindly. "Totally understood. But still, patterns matter. Just keep that in mind." And with that, he walked away. Marcus stood frozen in the hallway, a knot of confusion and shame blooming in his chest. Not because he had done something wrong, but because he had stopped doing something expected. The approval he once wore like a warm jacket now felt thin, threadbare, full of holes. He had always believed kindness was value. That covering for late shifts, staying silent when credit was stolen, picking up the emotional slack, that it made him irreplaceable. But now, he felt like an appliance, one that only mattered when in use, and in choosing to be unavailable, just once, he had become obsolete. That night, Marcus sat at his desk long after the others left. The office lights dimmed to automatic rest mode, and the city beyond the windows glowed soft and distant. His reflection stared back at him from the blackened screen. "I fused being loved with being used," he whispered, and the words felt like an earthquake under the surface. In the stillness, he thought of Jung's writing, of the idea that the shadow holds the parts of us we were taught to deny. He remembered reading that quote once, dismissing it, but now it clung to him like truth. He had encountered his shadow, not the rage, not the fear, but the voice that said, "I matter too." His chest tightened, his fingers curled slightly on the desk's edge. It wasn't the boundary that hurt, it was what it revealed. The mask he'd worn so long, of the helper, the fixer, the peacekeeper, had slipped, and the cold air against his real skin stung. Somewhere deep in memory, he recalled Jung's words. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And for the empath, that includes the part that says no. The moment came in the middle of a conversation, one that had started casually, almost forgettably. Owen had just returned from the team's third product launch in 6 weeks, his eyes heavy, his voice quieter than usual. His manager, Cole, a tall man with quick words and little patience, stepped into the glass conference room and dropped a file onto the table with a loud thud. "Need you to stay late again," Cole said flatly. "The presentation for the investors has to be rewritten tonight. The numbers changed." Owen didn't move at first. He sat still, blinking slowly, almost as if the sound hadn't registered. Then, without any edge, he replied, "I can't tonight. My brother's therapy session starts at 6. I promised I'd drive him." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was loud with implication. Cole's eyebrows lifted just slightly, his mouth tightening at the corners. "You're saying no?" Owen nodded once. "Yes. I've covered every weekend for the past month. This one, I can't." Cole scoffed. "I see. That's unfortunate." He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to. The disappointment in his voice was a scalpel, carefully wielded, and that was worse. Owen felt the tremor not in his hands, but in his chest, like an old alarm going off deep inside. By the time Owen returned to his desk, he could feel it spreading. The looks from 2 co-workers, subtle but sharp. The absence of a "thanks for earlier" message that usually came after he covered someone's shift. The way his Slack notifications slowed, then stopped. And just beneath all of that, the guilt. Not guilt for being rude, not guilt for abandoning the team, but guilt for disrupting a pattern. He hadn't just said no. He had broken the role he was cast to play. The steady one. The "of course" guy. The person who always absorbed the overflow so no one else had to. And now, he was no longer invisible in that role. He was visible in his absence. That night, as he sat alone in his car, parked in the dim lot outside his brother's clinic, the guilt pulsed through him like static. His brother was inside, laughing with the therapist through the windowed lobby. Owen should have felt relief. Pride. He was here, keeping a promise that mattered. But all he felt was wrong. He stared at his hands, gripping the wheel. He remembered his father's voice when he was a child. "Don't be selfish, Owen. Other people have it worse." He remembered his mother, exhausted from double shifts, whispering, "It's just easier when you don't cause trouble." He didn't cry, but he didn't move either. Carl Jung once said that guilt doesn't always mean we've done something morally wrong. It often means we've stepped outside the identity we were conditioned to uphold. Owen was raised to believe love was earned, not given. That service was currency. That peace only came when no one was upset, especially not at him. So now, sitting in that car, the guilt wasn't just about one choice. It was about every silent agreement he'd made before this moment. And it terrified him. The next morning, Cole didn't speak to him, not during the meeting, not in the hallway. One colleague, Drew, asked Owen if he was okay. but in a tone that felt more like accusation than concern. He lied and said, "Yeah, just tired." But deep down, something had shifted. The guilt, still there, began to unravel. Not fully, not loudly, but enough for him to wonder, why do they only value me when I say yes? At lunch, he walked past the break room, overhearing Cole mutter to someone else, "I guess Owen's not as reliable as we thought." It hit hard. But instead of folding, Owen paused. He didn't walk in. He didn't explain. He didn't rush to repair the version of himself they were missing. He let the silence hang, and that was the beginning. He realized the guilt he felt was not born from wrongdoing. It was born from rebellion, from pushing back against a system that taught him that love, approval, and even basic respect had to be earned through obedience. But this guilt wasn't his. It was theirs. It was the residue of a role that served everyone but him. In the quiet that followed, a new voice began to form, not loud, not certain, but present. A voice that asked a simple question. What if you're allowed to matter, even when you're not useful to others? Owen didn't have the answer yet, but he knew this. He wasn't going to play small so others could feel big. He wasn't going to shrink to fit their comfort. And as he stood at the edge of that inner shift, he remembered what someone once said. Maybe it was in a book, maybe in a dream. "You're not obligated to remain small so others can feel safe," Jung might remind them. "You're not here to be consumed." "I can't do that today," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady but low. He didn't raise it, didn't slam a fist, didn't even flinch, but his words, so simple, so unfamiliar in his own mouth, hung in the air like a dropped glass in a quiet room. Across the desk, Simon blinked. "What do you mean you can't?" he asked, the smile on his face tilting ever so slightly into confusion. "I mean I won't," Daniel clarified, eyes fixed on the papers in front of him, though his vision had already blurred with the weight of the moment. "It's my father's cardiology consult this afternoon. I've moved too many things already. I'm going with him this time." The office was silent for a second too long. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed louder. Simon leaned back in his chair, lips pursed. "It's just a meeting with the Zurich team. You've done 4 of those this quarter. I just figured—" He trailed off. But Daniel knew what he figured. He figured Daniel would do what he always did, what he'd always been relied on to do. Absorb, accommodate, comply. That's what Daniel had been for as long as he could remember. The fixer, the bridge, the one who never let anything fall through. He was the person people trusted to clean up the emotional messes they didn't acknowledge making. Even in childhood, his father's temper never left scars on Daniel's siblings because Daniel had learned to absorb it. Even in university, he'd offered tutoring and companionship without being asked, afraid people would leave if he didn't. And now, in this clean, modern office, with its quiet coffee machine and its echo of muted tones, Daniel had finally said the word he never allowed himself to. No. Simon didn't respond right away. He simply stood up, grabbed his laptop, and walked out of the glass-walled conference room without another word. Daniel sat still for a long time, heart thudding, not with triumph, but with nausea. A sour heat flushed his stomach as familiar guilt began to crawl in, clawing at the moment. He didn't feel powerful. He felt like a traitor. He turned toward the glass, looking out over the city skyline, remembering something his therapist had once said. The first time you choose yourself, it will feel like abandonment, because you've been abandoning yourself for everyone else. And it was true. Daniel didn't feel strong. He felt like a failure. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he'd broken the role everyone had written for him, the one he'd agreed to without knowing. That if he wanted to be accepted, he must always be agreeable. That to be loved, he must always be available. He stood and walked to the restroom, splashing cold water on his face. In the mirror, he barely recognized himself, not physically, but emotionally. He wasn't the smiling helper, not right now. He looked tired, raw, real, and something about that felt honest. The hours that followed didn't ease his discomfort. A few colleagues avoided eye contact. Messages slowed. A shared lunch meeting was cancelled without explanation. The discomfort wasn't in what he had said, but in how the system reacted. The same system that had praised him for being dependable now punished him for being different. By evening, Daniel sat in his car outside the hospital waiting for his father to finish paperwork. He glanced at his phone. No updates from the Zurich team. No apology from Simon. Just a quiet stream of unanswered emails and the dull ache of uncertainty. He looked over at his father through the window. The older man sat in a wheelchair, thinner than Daniel remembered from childhood, reviewing documents with a distant look. Not once had his father asked for this accompaniment, but Daniel knew, deep in his bones, that being here mattered, not just to his father, but to himself. This wasn't a rejection of others, it was a recognition of self, a realignment. And in that moment, something subtle but important shifted. He still felt guilty, but now he understood the guilt wasn't truth. It was residue, an echo of a version of himself who thought love had to be earned by sacrifice. He exhaled slowly, resting his hand on the steering wheel as the sun lowered behind the skyline. His thoughts returned to a phrase he'd written down once but never believed until now. Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, Jung wrote, but by integration of the contraries. And as Daniel watched his father roll toward the car with a quiet nod of gratitude, he realized he hadn't betrayed anyone. He'd simply chosen both truths, care and self-respect. And for the first time, they weren't at odds. And sometimes, the kindest thing an empath can do is to finally say no. He stood perfectly still, fingers frozen above the keyboard, the meeting window still open on his laptop. Julian had just said no. Across the screen, his manager's smile vanished like someone had shut off a switch. The silence that followed was thin and sharp, the kind of silence that doesn't wait, it judges. "I see," his manager said, voice clipped. "We'll rearrange coverage." The screen went black. Julian stared at the empty call log, heart hammering like he'd just broken something sacred. All he'd done was decline to stay late. His younger brother's school had called. Ryan had a panic episode during class. Their mother was out of town. It wasn't a debate. Julian had to go. But as he packed his laptop, dread slid in fast and familiar. Not just dread of missing work, but dread of being seen as unreliable, irresponsible, selfish. He felt it curl in his stomach, sharp and acidic. The guilt. Driving to the school, Julian's thoughts spiraled. Had his tone sounded too cold? Should he have explained more? Should he have offered to make up the hours later? The guilt wasn't logical, but it was loud. As if by saying, "I can't," he had somehow failed everyone. At the school nurse's office, Ryan sat curled up on the cot, knees pulled to his chest. His breathing was slow but shaky. "Hey," Julian said gently, kneeling beside him. "I'm here." Ryan opened one eye, managing a weak smile. "You left work?" Julian nodded. "Of course I did." For a moment, nothing moved. Then Ryan leaned into him, resting his forehead on Julian's shoulder. Julian held him, staring at the faded linoleum tiles, the ceiling fan humming above. But even there, guilt buzzed underneath. Not for being with his brother, but for feeling like he had let someone else down in the process. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have to choose like this." That night, Julian opened his laptop again. Slack messages blinked across the screen. "Hey, just checking if you'll still push the bug fix. Can we count on you to reschedule with the client? Didn't think you'd bail mid-sprint, man." He didn't reply. He couldn't. Instead, he stood and walked into the kitchen. The apartment was quiet. Dishes stacked neatly, notes on the fridge, Ryan asleep in the next room. He leaned against the counter, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and tried to trace the source of the ache he felt. And then, like a photograph sliding into focus, a memory came. He was 10. His father had slammed a door during an argument. His mother had cried at the sink. Julian, still in his school uniform, had walked over quietly, tugged on her sleeve, and offered her a glass of water. She had smiled. "You always know how to make things better," she'd whispered, as if he were the balm for all things broken. That was the beginning, the moment he learned that fixing others earned love, that soothing made him valuable, that if someone hurt around him, he was responsible for their healing. So now, when his boss frowned or a teammate grumbled, his body reacted like it was a 10-year-old again, standing in a broken kitchen, trying to fix a storm he didn't cause. Julian sank to the floor of his apartment, not in weakness, but in understanding, because something inside him had cracked, not loudly, but clearly. He saw the pattern now, the endless loop of absorbing other people's moods, their frustrations, their disappointments, as if they were his fault. He thought of what Jung might say, that this was projection, that the pain of others had become his burden because he didn't know it could be put down, that he was mistaking discomfort for danger, that he had confused disapproval with moral failure. His phone buzzed. A new message from his manager. "I'm disappointed, Julian. I expected more." He didn't reply. He stared at the message for a long time. Then, finally, he powered off the phone, walked back to Ryan's room and stood in the doorway. "Did I make the right choice?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer. Ryan stirred in bed, voice drowsy. "You came for me," he murmured. "That's the only thing that felt right today." Julian smiled, eyes stinging, not from weakness, but from release. He understood now. The guilt he carried had never belonged to him. It belonged to the idea that his existence had to be earned by absorbing everyone else's emotions. That silence meant safety. That obedience meant belonging. But it was time to return what was never his to hold. And as he turned off the hallway light, Julian felt something inside settle, not loudly, but fully. A peace earned not through sacrifice, but through truth. This is projection, a Jungian concept where the pain of others becomes your burden. But healing begins when you return what isn't yours. Sophia tapped her badge against the glass panel outside the HR office, the click of the door unlocking louder than usual in the quiet hallway. She stepped inside, offered a polite nod to the clerk, and handed over the typed memo. A single-page boundary. Clear, firm, respectful. Effective immediately. I will not be available for work-related communication after 7 p.m. No explanation, no apology. Just clarity. The HR rep, a man named Darren with thinning hair and eyes that darted too quickly, read the statement with a practiced neutrality. "Of course," he said, voice light. "You're within your rights. We'll notify your team." He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. Just enough ambiguity to keep her uncertain. That uncertainty followed her out of the room like static. By the next day, it began. Not outright backlash. Nothing so direct. Just a shift. In meetings, her suggestions landed flatter. Fewer nods. The intern who once asked for her input now glanced at his screen instead. Tom, the junior analyst who used to greet her with a warm, "Sophia, lifesaver." Each morning, barely looked up when she walked in, and James, her manager, called her in to discuss a project update. Nothing unusual, except for the tone. "I've noticed," James said, not looking at her but rather at the shifting graphs on his tablet, "that your presence has been quieter lately. Everything okay?" "I'm focusing more during work hours," Sophia replied evenly. "Trying to be more intentional." He nodded. But there was a pause too long to be neutral. Just be careful not to seem disconnected. Some folks have mentioned a change in energy. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The message was clear. Setting boundaries had cost her more than overtime. It had cost her her place in the room, or at least the illusion of it. She returned to her desk, fingers hovering above the keyboard as she reread old emails, thank yous from colleagues, praise from clients, the kind of words that once filled her up. Now they felt distant, like reading a compliment written to someone else. The team's group chat still pinged jokes and after-hour memes, but Sophia no longer replied. And the silence from her side wasn't passive, it was deliberate. Still, the ache it left behind gnawed at her like withdrawal. Later that week, in the break room, she overheard two voices behind the coffee machine. She's different now. I don't know. Something's off. She probably thinks she's above us now. No late calls? Come on. Sophia didn't confront them. She simply poured her coffee and left, but the words echoed. At home that night, she sat in silence, the glow of her laptop screen reflecting off her framed award from last quarter. Employee of the Month, dedication beyond expectation. She stared at it, numb. That phrase, beyond expectation, used to feel like pride. Now it felt like a warning label. When her phone buzzed at 9:13 p.m. with a Slack notification, she let it ring out. Her heart raced, her breath tightened, but she didn't reach for it. She went to the window instead, watching the faint blur of traffic beneath her apartment building. Cars moved with urgency, but she stayed still. The next morning, James approached again. Hey, just so you know, Darren from HR mentioned your request. Totally understandable, of course. Just be aware of how that might affect collaboration. There it was, the shift from polite understanding to veiled consequence. I understand, she said. But her eyes didn't drop this time. They met his. James hesitated, then walked away. By Friday, the tone in meetings was undeniable. Praise she once received now went to others. Tasks she used to lead were quietly reassigned. And yet, something inside her remained unshaken. The guilt still knocked. It told her she was letting people down, becoming cold, unhelpful. But she recognized it now, not as a truth, but as a ghost of the role she used to play. That night, as she reviewed her performance report from the previous quarter, she paused at one line James had written months earlier. Sophia is the heartbeat of this team. She had reread that sentence many times before, always with warmth. Now it felt like a transaction. As long as she gave more than she had, she was loved. The moment she protected her peace, she became a problem. Sophia closed the file. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply sat there, breathing slowly as the truth settled like evening dust around her. They hadn't loved her. They had loved her availability, and she had mistaken that for love. She walked to her kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and let the silence be what it was, not empty, but honest. Her phone remained on the counter, buzzing again at 8:17 p.m. She didn't pick it up, not out of spite, but out of reverence for herself, for her time, for the part of her that no longer needed to earn rest through burnout. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, Sophia finally stood still, not frozen, not waiting, just present, whole. And as she placed the old award face down in her drawer, a quiet line whispered through her mind. Not from guilt, not from fear, but from truth. Sophia is not less. She's finally whole. Caleb didn't hesitate when Darren asked if he could take his lunch break early. Not today, Caleb said, his voice firm, not cruel. But in the silence that followed, something else spoke louder, the shift in Darren's eyes, the furrow of his brow, the polite nod masking disappointment. Caleb caught it all, and for a moment, guilt curled in his stomach like a tightening wire. He had always said yes. Always adjusted, always softened the edges of his own needs so others wouldn't feel the prick of discomfort. But today, something stopped him. He stood still by the copier, watching Darren walk away with a stiff back, and he knew this wasn't about lunch. It was about the role he'd stopped playing. The office buzzed quietly behind him, phones ringing, keyboards tapping, the faint thud of footsteps over carpet tiles. But Caleb's world had shrunk to the echo of that look Darren gave him, the one that said, "You're not who I thought you were." And maybe he wasn't. Maybe for the first time he was someone else, someone closer to the truth. By the time Caleb returned to his desk, he felt the shift spreading. Eli from finance didn't say good morning. Josh didn't send over the usual project notes. Even Thomas, his manager, barely nodded. It was as if his no had triggered a silent alarm, and now the social fabric that once wrapped him in warmth was pulling back. The smallest ripples, forgotten greetings, paused conversations as he entered the room felt like tidal waves to his nervous system, and beneath it all, the question pulsed. Had he done something wrong? He kept working, but the thoughts didn't stop. Caleb wasn't new to guilt. He'd been carrying it for years like a second skin. Guilt when his mother cried and he couldn't fix it. Guilt when his college roommate spiraled and he couldn't help. Guilt when a co-worker vented for hours and he nodded along, shoulders burning with silent agreement. He thought kindness meant always being available. He thought love was earned through flexibility, but now he was learning the price of that belief. At 3:17 p.m., Thomas finally called him in. "I just want to check in," Thomas said, sitting behind his sleek desk, fingers steepled. "There's been a change in your tone lately." Caleb sat still, choosing each word like glassware in a storm. "I've been prioritizing clarity." Thomas didn't blink. "And clarity is good, but some folks feel you're less approachable. Maybe a little less of a team player." There it was, the real concern. Not about performance, about persona. The mask he had worn for so long, of the agreeable, always-there guy, was cracking. And now people were reacting not to his actions, but to his absence from the role they'd cast him in. Caleb met Thomas's gaze. "I'm still part of the team. I just won't be the cushion anymore." Thomas leaned back slightly. "You're sure that's wise? The culture here thrives on flexibility." Caleb's chest rose once, deliberately. "I'm done confusing flexibility with self-erasure." There was a beat of silence. Then Thomas exhaled, slow and uncertain. "All right," he said. "Let's see how that plays out." Back at his desk, Caleb felt the tremor again, not from fear, but from awareness. He hadn't lost himself. He had just stopped diluting himself, and the world around him, used to the softer version, didn't know how to respond. But he did. That night, walking home, he passed the corner cafe where he used to wait for everyone's calls, where he used to answer late-night texts, review presentations he wasn't paid for, soothe others' anxiety like it was his job. He didn't stop. He kept walking. His phone buzzed. A text from Darren. "Rough day. Can we talk?" Caleb paused. The wind carried the sharp scent of rain on pavement. For a moment he looked at the screen and felt the old pull. Respond now. Fix. Soothe. Become what they need. But then he slipped the phone into his pocket. Maybe later. Maybe not. This was new ground. Uneasy, unfamiliar, but real. And he realized the discomfort he felt wasn't proof of cruelty. It was proof of change. Those furrowed brows, those silences, those disapproving sighs, they weren't about him. They were about losing the version of him people could control. He breathed in, slow, no applause, no validation, just space. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like himself. Sometimes we must disappoint others to remain honest with ourselves. No, he said softly, but the word landed like thunder. The office fell silent. Across from him, Reuben blinked, phone still in hand, waiting for the usual answer. Just a quick call, Reuben repeated, gesturing toward the blinking project timeline on the screen. 5 minutes, Max. You're the only one who knows the back-end loop. Kyle looked down at his wristwatch, the second hand slicing time with unnerving precision. It was 8:47 p.m. His son's school project was still sitting on the kitchen table, unglued, his dinner untouched. And yet, in this moment, it wasn't about the missed meal or missed memories. It was about the pause. I won't be able to jump on tonight, Kyle replied, firmer now. I'll handle it first thing in the morning. Reuben's mouth twitched. All right, he muttered. But the disappointment was thick enough to scrape from the air. As he turned away, Kyle could feel it, the subtle shift. Not rage, not insult. Worse, withdrawal. A silent tally mark against him. And just like that, the old reflex kicked in. Kyle's chest tightened. His thumb grazed the side of his phone as if reaching for the unsent apology he used to text in moments like this. Sorry, just realized I might have come off harsh. Let me know if you still need me tonight. But he didn't type it. Instead, he let the silence sit. He sat alone in the glow of the monitor, the cursor blinking on a half-finished email, and the question rose up from deep inside him, not loud, but seismic. Is this mine to carry? Kyle had once worn reliability like armor. In every office he had entered, from internships to boardrooms, he became the one who absorbed. If someone missed a deadline, Kyle covered. If tempers flared, Kyle de-escalated. If someone vented at 10 p.m., Kyle listened until midnight. He didn't just solve problems, he inherited them. Quietly, constantly, until even his own emotions began to feel like intrusions. But tonight, the pause had widened, and in that space between request and response, something shifted. He pushed back from the desk, slowly, as if even movement needed permission now. His hand hovered over the laptop lid, but this time he didn't go back to check Slack one more time. Instead, he rose and stepped away. The hallway to the kitchen felt longer than usual. The fridge hummed. A light flickered above the sink. And there on the table, his son's project waited. Cardboard volcano, half-formed, patient. Kyle sat down and picked up the glue stick, his shoulders lowered as he worked. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about reclaiming 100 others like it that he had given away out of guilt. His phone buzzed once. Reuben. Never mind, I handled it. That single sentence didn't sting, it revealed. Kyle hadn't broken the project. He hadn't let the team fall. He had simply handed responsibility back to where it belonged. Later that night, lying in bed, Kyle stared at the ceiling fan. The silence felt strange, almost dangerous. Not because the world was angry, but because no one was calling him. No one needed him in that exact second. For years, that stillness had been a threat. It meant irrelevance. It meant loss. But now, it simply meant peace. His mind wandered to something he had once underlined in a worn book. The guilt still arises, but now it's met with clarity. He whispered it again in his mind, turning it over like a coin in his palm. And then another memory surfaced, an earlier version of himself, 26 and overworked, getting praised for handling a crisis while quietly shaking in the stairwell after skipping his father's funeral to meet a product launch deadline. No one ever asked why he had stayed. No one questioned the cost. They just called him dependable. Now, years later, he was learning a new language, one where silence wasn't a failure, where distance didn't mean desertion, where love could live in balance. The next morning, Kyle walked into the office and didn't flinch when Reuben barely nodded. He opened his laptop without apology, without explanation, because for the first time he understood. Guilt was not proof of harm, it was the echo of an old persona unraveling. As he stepped into the meeting room, coffee in hand, he caught his own reflection in the glass wall. He looked calm, present, whole, and he smiled, not for anyone else, but for himself. Boundaries are not the end of connection, they are the beginning of authenticity. "No," he said quietly, but the silence that followed made it feel like he'd shouted. It was the weekly team sync, just 6 people gathered around a glass table in a downtown co-working loft that smelled of lavender hand sanitizer and burnt espresso. The request was simple, or so it seemed. "Could you take over the event planning for this quarter too?" Ezra, the team lead, had asked casually, flipping through a printout as if the question were rhetorical. His tone carried no pressure, but the eyes around the room had already turned toward Nolan. It wasn't the words. It was the pause. The presumption. Everyone expected him to say yes. But Nolan didn't. Not this time. He sat back in his chair, feeling his heartbeat in his throat. "I'm at full capacity," he said. "Slower now. So I'll have to pass on that." Ezra blinked. 1 second. 2. Then offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he replied, adjusting the papers in his hands with too much focus. "Thanks for letting us know." The room moved on, or pretended to. But Nolan didn't. Not really. As the meeting continued, his mind drifted, not toward guilt, but toward the ache beneath it. His throat tightened as if it had swallowed years of unspoken yeses, and they were now rising like steam. He had said no. 1 word, 2 letters, but it felt like he had shattered glass. By the time the meeting ended, 3 people walked past him without making eye contact. One of them, Jeremiah, gave a subtle nod, but no words. That was unusual. Nolan stood slowly, collected his notes, and offered a faint smile to the room. No one returned it. The hallway outside felt colder than usual. As he moved toward the elevator, his phone buzzed. A Slack message from Ezra. "Let's chat later. Might be good to recalibrate priorities." Nolan stared at the screen, thumbs trembling slightly, then put it away without replying. The ride down was quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. Because the shame wasn't about the message. It wasn't about Ezra. It wasn't even about the project. It was about his father. He remembered being 12, hearing raised voices downstairs, his mother crying, his younger brother cowering beneath the table. Nolan had crept down quietly, kneeling beside his brother, wrapping thin arms around trembling shoulders, while whispering, "It's okay, I'm here." He had learned early that silence keeps the peace, that holding your needs inside was the cost of protecting others, that to matter, you had to disappear. But here he was now, 32 years old, sitting on a bus bench outside the office, jaw tight, stomach twisting, because he had dared to break that rule. He had dared to choose himself. And now his body recoiled, as if he had committed a crime. "This isn't about now," he whispered to himself, barely audible above the traffic. "This is about all the times I didn't." He saw flashes, missed birthdays because a friend needed him, overlapping meetings he never declined, the time his landlord forgot to process his rent discount and he said nothing because he didn't want to cause trouble. The layers were endless and heavy. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Nolan was beginning to see that he hadn't been guided by kindness. He'd been ruled by a contract, an invisible pact that said, "Don't upset anyone. Don't say no. Don't exist too loudly." And today, by saying no, he hadn't just turned down a task, he had violated the ancient rules written by survival. That was the real panic, the fear that if he said no, He would no longer belong. The guilt he felt wasn't guilt. It was grief. Grief for the boy who held too much. Grief for the young man who never knew rest. Grief for the adult who thought love was earned through usefulness. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Nolan stood at the window, city lights flickering like signals he didn't yet know how to interpret. His phone buzzed again, another message from Ezra. "Want to grab coffee this week? Let's talk through team needs." Nolan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat down at his small kitchen table, pen in hand, and wrote 4 words on a sticky note. "Is this mine to carry?" He read it, then read it again. The words didn't solve anything, but they offered something rarer: permission. And in that pause, between reflex and reply, something in him shifted. Not a full transformation. Not yet. But a tremor. He would still struggle, still flinch at the sound of disappointment, still feel the sting when connection thinned. But tonight, in the quiet, he understood something he hadn't before. Every time the empath speaks up, they're not just healing the present, they're freeing every younger version of themselves who wasn't allowed to. He said it quietly. "This doesn't work for me." The words hung in the air like dust in sunlight, small, weightless, but impossible to ignore. Across the table, Darren blinked, his mouth opened slightly, as if to respond, but nothing came out. A pause stretched between them. Then a smirk curled at the edge of Darren's lips, not amusement, but something colder. "I see," he said, placing his coffee down a little too hard. "So, you're one of those now." Malik felt his jaw tighten. He hadn't expected gratitude, but he hadn't expected that either. Around them, the downtown cafe buzzed with after-work energy, cutlery clinking, chairs scraping tile, but inside their small corner booth, time slowed. It wasn't the first time Malik had tried to say no, but it was the first time he said it without flinching. Darren leaned forward. "Look, you've always been the guy we could count on. When things got messy, you fixed it. You don't just get to pull back now. People rely on you." Malik looked at the table, where his fingers were pressed together so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. His voice, when it came, was steady. "That's exactly why I need to step back, because I became the fix, not a person." Darren's eyes narrowed. "This isn't you, man." But it was. Malik just hadn't introduced this version yet. The projection hit like a wave. Darren wasn't just responding to Malik's words, he was reacting to the mirror they held up. For years, Darren had vented, leaned, delegated, and expected. And Malik? He absorbed it. Not because he was weak, but because he mistook absorption for connection. But today, something cracked, and with it, the illusion Darren depended on. "You've changed," Darren said sharply, louder now, attracting a glance from the next table. "I hope so," Malik answered, eyes steady. He stood up, chest burning, not with guilt, but with clarity. As he turned to leave, he heard Darren mutter, "Unbelievable," as if Malik's boundary was an act of violence. But that was the trick of emotional dependence. It made self-respect look like betrayal. Out on the sidewalk, the city glowed under early evening light. Malik exhaled. That was the first time he had said no without padding it, without apologizing, without offering an emotional cushion for someone else's discomfort. And now, the world felt different. Not safer, not easier, but more real. He walked 3 blocks before the fear hit. What if Darren spread the word? What if the others pulled away too? What if the invitations stopped, the texts faded, the friendly banter turned distant? That was the old fear talking, the one wired deep inside since childhood, the one that said, to be loved, be useful, be quiet, be small. But another voice rose with it, quieter, but certain. What if none of that was love? He stopped walking. Malik thought of all the times he said yes while dying inside. The nights he answered calls at midnight, the projects he took on just to avoid conflict, the feelings he swallowed to keep things smooth. He remembered sitting in meetings nodding while someone else took credit. He remembered hearing, "You're just so easy to work with," and wondering if that praise was just reward for being silent. He was done mistaking approval for love. That evening, he called his friend Jordan. When Jordan picked up, Malik's voice cracked slightly. "I think I just broke something." "Broke what?" "A pattern." There was silence on the line. Then Jordan said, "Good. That pattern needed breaking." Malik looked up at the sky, stars just beginning to pierce the blue. For the first time in years, he felt the outline of himself, not the version people used, but the one they never got to meet. And maybe that version wasn't as agreeable. Maybe it ruffled feathers, but it was honest, and that was enough. Inside, something settled. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are truth. And truth often reveals what others try not to see, that love without control, without guilt, and without expectation is possible. But to those who benefit from the empath's silence, that mirror is threatening. So they lash out, not because the empath has done wrong, but because the illusion is breaking. Jung called this confrontation with truth the crisis of projection. The roles we play for others are often based on what they want to avoid in themselves. When the empath changes, it forces others to face their own unmet needs. That's why people often say, "You're not the same." And the empath, for the first time, can say, "I hope not." Because growth is not betrayal, it's evolution. Have you ever grown in a way that made others uncomfortable? The knock on his office door was soft, hesitant, but Elias didn't turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on the open window in front of him, clouds shifting lazily above the skyline, white against winter blue. Somewhere behind him, the door eased shut. No footsteps followed. Just silence. Elias exhaled through his nose, slow and even. Earlier that morning, he had done something that felt small and radical all at once. He had turned off his phone. Not for an hour, not for a meeting. He had powered it down, placed it in his desk drawer. Locked it. It had taken 12 seconds and 17 years of reflexively answering every late-night ping, every co-worker crisis, every family obligation, 17 years of being available. Reliable. The one who never let anyone down. And now, as the office hummed faintly outside his door, printers, shoes on carpet, the low rhythm of people pretending to be okay, he sat still for the first time in weeks. No calendar reminders, no unread message icons, just breath and space. Until the silence broke. "Elias?" A male voice, gentle, uncertain, came from behind him. It was Jared, the intern from legal. Kind, competent, too new to know what lines weren't supposed to be crossed. "I'm sorry to bother you," Jared said, "but someone from corporate's here asking for you. Said it's urgent." Elias stood slowly, not sighing, not rushing, just moving. When he stepped into the hallway, 3 people glanced up from their desks and quickly looked away. Jared gave a tight smile, one full of apology and confusion. "They said something about not being able to reach you," he added. "Because they weren't supposed to," Elias replied, and walked toward the elevators. In the mirrored panels, his own face looked back, tired. Yes, but not ashamed. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he owed the world an explanation for needing quiet. The guilt had whispered at him this morning, of course. As he brushed his teeth, brewed his coffee, watched the notifications pile up on the lock screen. The voice in his head had hissed, "They'll think you're neglecting them. You're dropping the ball. You're becoming selfish." But another voice had finally risen, not loud, but steady. "I was never too much. I was just giving too much to people who expected everything." It hadn't come out of nowhere. It had come after months of quiet resistance. Turning down a weekend call, saying, "I'll get back to you Monday." Letting someone else handle the minor disaster for once. Each small act had felt like failure, and yet, each time, nothing had collapsed. The world had spun on. No one had died, except the version of Elias that flinched every time someone frowned at him. Now, standing in the lobby, watching a corporate handler pace with folded arms and thinly veiled irritation, Elias felt the old pattern trying to snap shut. He could apologize, explain, make it right. That script still lived inside him like muscle memory. Instead, he walked straight past the handler and into the sunlit courtyard beyond the glass doors. "Elias," the man called out, "you can't just walk away." Elias didn't stop. He didn't owe him his presence. Not anymore. What he owed to himself was different. 3 weeks ago, during a quarterly meeting, Elias had quietly stated to his team, "I'll no longer be available after 6 p.m. There was no announcement, no preamble, just clarity. The room had stiffened. Martin from finance blinked 3 times. Greg actually scoffed. Only Sam, his data analyst, nodded with a slow, knowing smile. The backlash came subtly. Emails with timestamps questioning his urgency. Calendar invites labeled mandatory at 6:30 p.m. Slack messages from peers that started with, "I know you said you weren't online, but..." He hadn't replied. Not once. And slowly, something shifted. Not in them, in him. He stopped flinching at disapproval. He stopped trying to make it easy for others to misunderstand his boundaries. He stopped editing his needs to remain palatable. He simply stayed still. In the courtyard now, Elias sat on the edge of the fountain. The wind was cool. The world spun quietly. This wasn't the silence of loneliness. It wasn't the silence of shame. This was the silence that followed transformation. The silence that comes after a storm you survived without telling anyone you were in one. A silence that didn't beg for applause or seek understanding. It simply was. The kind that felt like power. He thought of something Jung had said once, scribbled long ago in one of the books that still sat beside his bed. Wholeness is not perfection. It is the ability to hold all parts of the self, even the ones we were taught to hide. Elias closed his eyes. Let the breeze touch his skin. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was failing anyone. He felt whole. The door clicked shut behind him with a soft finality, but the sound echoed like thunder in Marcus's chest. He had just said no, not with anger, not with explanation. Just a calm, grounded, "No, I won't be available this weekend." The request had been simple on the surface. Just another last-minute project handed down on a Friday evening, expected to be completed before Monday morning. His supervisor, Dean, didn't even flinch when he asked, just assumed compliance. But this time, Marcus had chosen otherwise. Dean's face stiffened. "You sure?" he said, one brow arching with that subtle pressure that had always worked before. "I've already made plans," Marcus replied, his voice firm but kind. Dean didn't argue. He just nodded, said, "All right," and turned away. But Marcus felt it immediately. The shift in air, the quiet judgment, the unspoken script he had just shredded. By Monday, the consequences arrived like clockwork. The morning greetings were shorter. A few co-workers who once leaned on him for help now gave clipped nods. Dean didn't include him in the brainstorming huddle that morning, and when the weekly recognition email went out, Marcus's name was conspicuously absent, even though he had contributed heavily to the prior week's deliverable. He sat at his desk, staring at his screen, pretending to read metrics. But inside, something was breaking, and something else was waking. He had always been the reliable one, the fixer, the go-to guy. People said it like a compliment, but now it echoed like a role, a performance, and the moment he stopped playing it, the applause vanished. Worse, it was replaced by silence that felt like exile. He closed his laptop, not out of frustration, but out of realization. His reflection caught faintly in the dark screen. He looked tired. Not physically, but soul-deep tired. The kind of tired that came from giving pieces of yourself to people who only knew how to take. In the hallway, a junior developer named Owen caught up with him. "Hey," Owen said, hesitating. "Everything okay?" Marcus smiled politely. "Yeah, why? I just heard Dean's been kind of cold after last week." Marcus nodded slowly, as if confirming something he hadn't dared say aloud. "He expected me to cancel on my brother's surgery prep weekend." Owen blinked. "You told him no?" "I did." There was a pause. Not judgmental, just quiet awe. Owen gave a slow, respectful nod. "Good. You should have." But Marcus didn't feel victorious. He felt guilty, deeply, achingly guilty, as if by prioritizing his own life, he had betrayed something sacred. Not the team, not Dean, but the version of himself they had come to depend on. The dependable one, the selfless one, the invisible one. And that's when the truth hit. The guilt didn't come from doing something wrong. It came from breaking a spell that had taught him his worth, lived in sacrifice. That if he wasn't endlessly giving, he wasn't enough. But whose spell was it? His parents, who praised him only when he was useful? His early mentors, who rewarded him for going above and beyond until he forgot where his own boundaries even were? Or was it the culture around him, the workplace applause for burnout dressed as commitment? In the stillness of the stairwell, Marcus sat down. No one there. Just him. The hum of the building's vents and the weight of a realization that felt like both grief and freedom. He had not disappointed anyone. Not truly. He had just stopped offering himself as a lifeline. He thought of something he had read once in a psychology book he didn't even remember buying. The empath is not breaking the rules, they're breaking the spell. He whispered it now, aloud, to no one. "I'm not breaking the rules, I'm breaking the spell." That spell had said love meant losing yourself. That kindness meant compliance. That to be seen, you must first disappear. But not anymore. Marcus stood, feeling a weight lift, not because everything was fixed, but because he had found the truth beneath the role. He didn't need permission to protect his peace. He didn't need to feel guilty for saying no, and he didn't need to go back to disappearing to be accepted. He would still be kind, still be thoughtful, but no longer at the cost of his own voice. He knew this would not be the last time he felt guilty. He knew the echoes of his old conditioning would come back, whispering that he was selfish or difficult. But now he had something stronger, awareness. And with that awareness came choice. So when Dean passed him later that day with a perfunctory nod, Marcus returned it, not cold, not distant, but grounded. And when the next after-hours favor was hinted at, Marcus smiled gently and said, "I'll be offline tonight. Hope everything goes smoothly." This time he didn't flinch, and the silence that followed. It didn't feel like rejection. It felt like space. Marcus didn't lose himself. He found himself. And in that moment, as Jung might say, you become the one thing no one can take away, yourself.